what counts as history, what's worth studying, has changed over time. History as a discipline, and I think that's a useful way to think about history, became professionalized. You had professional historians really emerging in the 19th century and being part of universities and it being taught as a subject at university, particularly in the West. History is about states, important men, and the church. So many different things count as history, but it's really how you approach it and who's doing it. I think that's important. When you say history is seen as written by the victors, yes, then we have to say, okay, we have to put it in the context in which it was written, by whom, when, after what happened. The dispute over Kurundu Malay is not new, but it's also not unique to Kurundu Malay. Is that this is yet another iteration of who came here first.
A very good day and welcome to all of you. We are here with another episode of Genpodcast. If as a country we plan to build a successful future, we need to learn lessons from our history. When we delve into discussions about histories, like in countries like Sri Lanka, it often reveals multitude of complex issues that needs our attention. So today's episode will address this very topic under the title Our History. To discuss about this topic, we have Dr. Shamara Wettimuny with us here present today. Dr. Shamara is the incoming Junior Research Fellow in History at the Queen's College, University of Oxford. She completed her doctorate in history from Brasenose College, University of Oxford. Her doctorate focused on identity formation and ethno-religious violence during British colonial rule in Sri Lanka. She also has an MSc and BSc in International Relations and History, both from the London School of Economics. She is also the founder of Itihas, an organization that advances history education reform in Sri Lanka. Welcome, Shamara, and thank you for joining us here with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Anju. It's a pleasure to be here today. And I've said it before, but allow me to say it again. I'm a big fan of the work that #Generation is doing. So I'm especially pleased to be speaking to you today here.
So without further ado, let's delve into our discussion. So you are a historian. So we usually think of history as something to do with the past. Can you tell us what history is and why is it important?
Sure, Anju. So it may seem like you're asking me a straightforward question, but it's quite a difficult one to answer because there's so many ways to say respond to the question, what is history? So let me try and get at it from one angle at least and say what constitutes history. So that idea itself, what counts as history, what's worth studying, has changed over time. History as a discipline, and I think that's a useful way to think about history, became professionalized. You had professional historians really emerging in the 19th century and being part of universities and it being taught as a subject at university, particularly in the West. And originally, those early historians thought history is about states, important men, and the church, right? But that has changed over time. And from only studying high politics and the feats of impressive men and religious structures, we now can look at the history of childhood, the global food histories. We can look at the histories of communities, whether big communities or small, lesser known ones. You can even look at the history of trees, and environmental and ecological histories is a growing space of really important history. So history, so many different things count as history, but it's really how you approach it and who's doing it. I think that's important. And why is it important? Well, you actually alluded to that in your introduction to this podcast, because particularly in a country like Sri Lanka, where you have multiple contested and complicated narratives about who we are, how we came here, when we came here, history education is a really useful way to deal with these complex issues when it's done properly. The question is it being done properly in Sri Lanka at the moment?
Yes. So there is a popular saying that history is written by victors. What is your take on this?
Well, I suppose, again, to go back to that earlier point, histories were, earlier on, written by powerful people or for powerful people. So let's take, for instance, the Mahavamsa, which is an important primary source that's seen as a really important chronicle of the Sinhala history on this island. But we must remember, first of all, it's a primary source, not a secondary source. So it's not a professionally written history like that. But it's a court document written by monks associated with a particular fraternity, the Theravada Buddhist fraternity of the Mahavihara, writing about kings to whose court they belonged. So in a sense, when we read sources, we have to ask who is writing it and for whom. So when you say history is seen as written by the victors, yes, then we have to say, okay, we have to put it in the context in which it was written, by whom, when, after what happened. And that'll help us also assess its value or its credibility as a source. Of course, there are now increasing efforts by professional historians to tell more marginalized histories. So the histories of the vanquished, of what historians would call the subaltern, those less powerful, those looking up at power and speaking back to power or resisting powerful sources. Now, very often there is or at least this strand of history writing called, say, the subaltern studies, started really in the 1970s when historians tried to tell particularly a South Asian narrative of history that didn't feature before.
So how accurate do you think this saying, history is written by victors? How do they decide this?
Well, I think when it comes to state narratives, for example, in the context of wars all over the world, the winner has tended to has had the ability to shape what is known as the dominant narrative or the hegemonic narrative. So to some extent that's true, but I would beg to differ and not call it histories. Those are narratives. And they are probably more powerful and able to advance a particular narrative, but that is not the full history. So there are other histories involved, or there are other narratives that constitute a history of a particular episode or series of events.
So as you mentioned, there are other narratives of different versions of histories. So can you explain these different versions of histories?
I mean, that's a tough one. Are we speaking? Okay, let's take an example. I worked on the 1915 anti-Moor pogrom that is commonly referred to as the Sinhala Muslim riots. And in popular history, even in, for example, the document in the National Archives of Sri Lanka, which is the primary repository for historical materials in Sri Lanka, really talks about the experience of the Sinhalese who, after the pogrom, were suppressed very brutally by the British colonial state. But what seems to have been forgotten in a lot of these popular narratives, including the book in the National Archives that refers to 1915, was the experience of the original victims of the pogrom, the Moors. So that's an example of forgotten narratives or that are sidelined or marginalized for various issues, for various reasons.
So, and I would like to ask you, are these different versions of histories used to suppress the minorities?
Well, they have certainly been used. Certainly, I mean, it depends on what through what organs they're coming out. So the state. Let's put it like this. Let's talk again. Take another historical example. The colonial state, when it was in power in places like India, Ceylon at the time, they dominated and they had the ability to set the discourse, to set the narrative, because they control state power. And so, for instance, say those peasants, those farmers, those laborers who were brutally repressed during the Uva Vellassa rebellion of 1817-1818 or 1848 Matale rebellion weren't able to tell their story, because in that context, the colonial state controlled the narrative, at least as far as maybe the rest of the world was concerned. Similarly, in the post-colonial context, the state has similar abilities to set the narrative, to shape the public narrative, and they have the organs of state media at their disposal. So, yes, very often. But now, I suppose minorities also have to, or have been able to, find alternative ways of writing their histories back into our consciousness. And that is something that's very important. Let's take, for example, the 1983 anti-Tamil pogrom. There's been some really important work that's been done in archiving the experiences of victims, who were previously denied to have been victims by the state. The state in 1983 didn't really acknowledge the extent of violence and damage done to innocent civilians. And I think slowly we are becoming much more familiar with the extent of harms caused by mobs, tacitly enabled so by perhaps state organs or state actors, are now being really recognized.
So to a recent point, if I come to a recent point, so we often hear we hear of contested versions of history in Sri Lanka. So for an example, recently, many interpretations related to sites such as Kurundumale have emerged. How do we know what is the truth?
That's a really good example. And unfortunately, in the case of recent disputes over archaeological sites, the so-called experts, the archaeologists, don't appear particularly neutral. And they have been, the Department of Archaeology has been repeatedly accused of prioritizing one particular narrative over others. I mean, one look at the emblem of the department, which has Dagaba, kind of reflects the type of sites they're interested in conserving and protecting. Now, the dispute over Kurundu Malay is not new, but it's also not unique to Kurundu Malay. In fact, my reading of it, and I'm not an archaeologist, I'm a historian, so I can only analyze discourse around this issue, is that this is yet another iteration of who came here first. So it's clear, for instance, that there is some Buddhist history or heritage in that site. It's become much more politicized in the last so many years, and therefore it's been prioritized by the state as a place for reconstruction. Now, I don't think there's much dispute over whether it's Buddhist or not. It's more a question of whose Buddhist site is it? Is it Sinhala Buddhist or is it Tamil Buddhist? And there's a very important paper written by a professor called G.P.V. Somaratna, who talks about the historical existence of Tamil Buddhists, which perhaps people are less familiar with and almost threatened, although I don't understand why particularly ultra-nationalists on both sides, Sinhala and Tamil, have tried to deny the historical existence of Tamil Buddhists. So this is yet another case of who has ownership and authenticity in that area, who can claim that land. This is not unique to that particular site, but we've seen it happen elsewhere as well. And it seems that particularly in the context of heritage and heritage management in Sri Lanka, there are some who see it as let's call it a chessboard, and one site being claimed by, say, Buddhists or Tamils is seen as a direct loss for the other side. And this is just another piece. Kurundumalai then must be understood as just another piece on this chessboard of heritage management.
So I would like to ask you, how do we approach these challenging narratives in relation to these contested sites?
That's a tougher one for me to answer. I'm not sure I have a very clear solution. But I think we have to understand that these are complex. They have not emerged in the last 2 years with, say, a minister going and inaugurating a site or contesting it. There's archaeological evidence that Tamils, Buddhists, Hindus, Sinhalese have been active in that site. And I really think, where we talk about reconciliation and coexistence and social cohesion, all these buzzwords, this is an example of where it's a case of we need to live and let live. We need to acknowledge that Sri Lanka, whether the north or the south, is a historically plural and diversified place with different groups living in these regions. It's not just Sinhalese and Tamils. We have minorities that we don't even discuss or feature. Let's take the Malayaha Tamil community. They're not even reflected in the National Museum of Sri Lanka, which is meant to, which is probably built at a time in the late 1800s, when with the money made by the colonial state of tea exports at the time, our tea plantation. So there's probably a lot more erasure than visibility over all the presence and importance of all communities in Sri Lanka. But it seems we're very set on saying, I came here first and therefore this place is mine.
So as a final question, I would like to ask you overall, how do we approach these different historical narratives critically?
So my recourse would be to better education. I think currently our public school history syllabus is deficient because it does not teach an inclusive version of history. History is for me, the subject in which young children really get an idea of who they are, how they belong, how they fit into society in Sri Lanka. And unfortunately, a reading of the existing history syllabus is a very one-dimensional narrative. As I said, like with the museum, the syllabus leaves out more than it includes. And until we teach children that they're all equal, and it doesn't really matter whether you came 2 centuries before me, we're not going to be able to move forward.
Thank you, Dr. Shamara. So during today's episode, we were able to discuss actually what history is and the importance of history and the different versions of history and how can these different versions affect certain groups, and also how these historical narratives are built upon around these contested sites, and overall taken, how can we approach these historical narratives critically. So thank you once again, Dr. Shamara, for joining us with us today and for your inputs and valuable thoughts. Our videos are accessible in sign language for differently abled audience as well. Hope to see you soon with an interesting current topic, again from another episode of Genpodcast.
Thank you.